Hi everyone, welcome back to another Graflex video. For today's video we're going to be looking at this vintage Graflex in the style of The Force Awakens / The Last Jedi. I recently purchased this from someone who was selling it on Facebook. A good friend of mine called Shane. A really great vintage in excellent condition. What made me want to take this is that not only is it a vintage, but it's also a Folmer from the top. So Folmer with a Folmer glass eye and an ink clamp and ink blower. So all the specifications exactly match what was seen on film, or almost exactly, but I'll go into that a little bit more in detail later on. So starting at the top, we have a vintage Folmer Graflex, and we know it's a Folmer because of the smooth pins and the absence of the four sort of divots on the sides of the inner sleeve of the bunny ears band. So I'll just show you an ink bunny ears. So on an ink bunny ears, you can see there are two divots there on the bottom and two there on the other side, so there's four in total. On Folmers, as far as I know, you don't see that. I mean, this is my third Folmer top, and on none of them do I have the four divots on the bottom. So I think this is a tell of a Folmer, at least a Folmer top. That and the smooth pins there on the side. The other feature is, if you look at the beer tab rivet, you can see that it's slightly machined, but not as much as the ink beer tab, which is kind of thicker, shinier, and much more machined. You can see how thick that is in comparison. Very nicely machined as well. Compare that again to the Folmer, it's just a little bit more flat, so it's thinner. Here's another Folmer. Again, you can kind of see machining marks with that almost like a nipple in the middle, but it's definitely more sort of dull and flat. Once again, Folmer. They do look ever so slightly different, this one and the previous one. But there are generations of Folmer as well, but the ink one is definitely much more machined and kind of thicker. It's one of those things that you'll only be able to tell when you put them side by side. But it's definitely a Folmer top. And the glass eye is also a Folmer, which is accurate for The Force Awakens. For the longest time, I thought that the glass eye on The Force Awakens was an ink. It is a little bit harder to tell because of the sanded down knurling to reveal the brass, and just the way that the pictures are, that it's usually angled this way or sort of that way, so it's not always easy to tell. But I have seen a reference picture with it angled that way from Star Wars Celebration, where you can quite clearly see that the telltale kind of sharp incline of a Folmer glass eye, which I'll compare that to an ink glass eye. On an ink glass eye, the edges inside, it kind of goes in like that and curves. It's a much softer curve. On a Folmer, they go sort of like that. Here is another Folmer. You can see how sharp that angle of the incline is. Once again, compare that to an ink. It's much softer, much more rounded. So compare again Folmer to ink. You can kind of see that it's a sharper incline. So this is a Folmer glass eye, and having looked at the reference pictures, I was convinced that it was in fact a Folmer glass eye, not an ink. So yeah, this is quite rare because Folmer glass eyes are much more expensive than ink glass eyes. So you won't find a lot of people who will destroy their glass eye if it's a Folmer by doing the sanding, and most people just use an ink because it's cheaper and more readily available. So that was quite nice, just an extra accuracy mod. The red button I think is an ink. Well, I'm pretty sure it's an ink, but we don't know if the red button on the prop is an ink or Folmer, so it doesn't really matter. It's really hard to tell with red buttons. You have to have it super close up and have a look at, you know, every kind of ink, the incline, the step. It's just very, very difficult to do on the actual prop. So yeah, Folmer top, Folmer glass eye, ink red bottom. Now the only difference is in The Force Awakens, the actual prop has a super shiny chrome finish on the top. That's because it's a very early version of the Folmer that was made in 1928, and this is definitely a later Folmer, and these are more common. The early chrome 1928 Folmers are extremely rare, and if you find them, they will be quite expensive. So really the only difference between that and the other one, the prop, is the finish. This is a little bit more brushed. Again, not as brushed as an ink would be, but still brushed. Moving on down, here we have a vintage ink clamp, and we can tell it's an ink by the presence of the large machined lever rivet and overall smooth, very nice brushed finish. In contrast to the Folmer levers are a little bit more shiny. Ignore that, that's stuck on, that's just an additional thing. But a Folmer rivet is normally smaller and a bit more rounded, and they tend to rust quite easily. So this is a Folmer lever with an original Folmer rivet. So we know that this is an ink because it looks completely different. The clamp is covered with the etched steel band from WannaWanga to hide the Graflex stamping, and that is accurate to the film. I went with the Skywampa clamp card, as I always do. I slightly prefer the color of the traces of the Skywampa card to the WannaWanga card. There's nothing wrong with the WannaWanga card, it looks accurate as well. It's just the traces are a little bit more sort of orangey brown, and this is a little bit more gold. I have no idea which one is more accurate, but I just prefer the look of this. So yeah, that's the clamp area done. And now moving on to the lower. So the lower, once again, just as with the film prop, is a Graflex ink. And there are 6 T-tracks here made of resin that are from WannaWanga, with 6 rivets that have been popped, cut and glued onto the track so as not to drill holes into the body of the flash. And these have been arranged with a grip guide so it's accurate to the movie prop. And finally, in the pommel area, we have a Kobold, a pair of rivets and a D-ring, again from WannaWanga. Once again, these rivets have been popped, shortened so that they sit flush, and glued onto the Kobold, and then the whole assembly is glued onto the pommel so as to avoid drilling 2 holes into the body of the flash. And around the Kobold on both sides, you'll notice that there is some chrome tape. This is also accurate to the prop on both sides there to cover the stamping. One mod that I did is that if you look underneath this side of the Kobold, you'll see the letters R-E-D. I will just zoom into those now. You can see R-E-D, and that's part of the word manufactured, which is how we know that the lower of this prop is a Graflex ink, because Folmers don't have the word manufactured on them. It says made by the Folmer Graflex group, either with or without a patent number, but a Graflex ink always says manufactured by. And this was spotted on the prop at, I think, Star Wars Celebration. So keen-eyed fans were able to zoom into that bit and catch those 3 letters, and were therefore able to identify the lower as an ink. So that's the only mod I made. By mod I mean the lining up, because when I got this from Shane, it didn't line up like that. It wouldn't show those 3 letters, and I just wanted them just for accuracy's sake, so I made cuts over here. So I just cut further into it from the other side, again from the other side, so that when I put it back in, obviously this is going to be covered, so it doesn't matter really, well, to me at least. Putting it in like that, I'll twist it all the way around. Oh, I got it wrong. Let's try that again. So by lining up the top of the Kobold towards a clamp, we can now see the ID sticking out from the front. So that was just the only mod that I made to this. But otherwise, yeah, very, very beautiful vintage Graflex TFA style, Folmer top, Folmer glass eye, ink red button, ink clamp, ink lower, conversion parts for the clamp and lower area from WannaWanga, and Skywampa clamp card. And that is it. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and feel free as always to reach out with any questions or comments down below. I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.